Hello, this is Friar Tim with the third of our four-part series on synodality in the church. And today we'll be looking at the way synods were used to implement the reforms of the Council of Trent. So with that, let me get back to my PowerPoint, and I need to share my screen here. There we go. And there we go. Okay. Synodality in response to the Council of Trent. Once again, let me go through the whole concept of synodality to make sure that everybody's with me, and in case anyone has just dropped into this one without the first couple. The word synod comes from the Greek synodos. It is exactly equivalent to the Latin concilium. So therefore, from this sense, a synod and a council are basically the same thing. They both mean a gathering in order to make decisions. As we pointed out, they're an inheritance from Greco-Roman practice, and they were regularly used in the church up until the 14th century. They're a way of reaching consensus as higher authority develops. Now, there's lots and lots of these following the Council of Trent. Now, again, please keep in mind that the Council of Trent did not define the role of the papacy in the way that we know it. That is, papal infallibility on the one hand, and the immediate and direct jurisdiction of the Roman pontiff on the other. That was not defined until 1870 in the church. The Council of Trent did highlight the importance of the role of the Roman pontiff, but absolute, definitive, higher authority was still a little bit contested around the church. So there's lots and lots of synods in the period after 1563. They are both diocesan and provincial, that is, the archdiocese and all of the dioceses surrounding it. In this period, these are predominantly clerical gatherings. It's bishops and their priests really there for the concrete thing of implementing the reforms of Trent. Synodality, as we know it today, was given a lot more prominence, has been given a lot more prominence by Pope Francis. It's really a post-Vatican II development, and it is connected to a renewed understanding of the role of the baptized in the church. That is what is called in Latin the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful. That is, that the Holy Spirit does work in and through all the baptized, and therefore wider consultations seem to be a way to discern where the Holy Spirit is moving. In fact, it is estimated that the grassroots consultation that went into this synod is arguably the largest mass consultation in religious history, which is really kind of an interesting point to keep in mind. Again, the broad agenda topics are communion, that is, the internal life of the church, marked by participation in the sacraments and a living out of the universal call to holiness. Then how that internal life flows naturally into mission and external life. And in many ways, communion and mission are connected. The church is really a communion that does mission, or mission from the other end is the absolute hallmark and raison d'etre, the reason for being of the church. And if this is so, how does one govern this? How does one move this from one generation to the next? So with all of that introductory stuff, let's get into our own historical period. Prior to the Council of Trent, synods were frankly very deeply frowned upon. They were frowned upon because in the late Middle Ages, as a result of what is known as the Great Western Schism, in which at one point there were two rival popes, and much later, three rival popes, all claiming very legitimate election processes. It was felt that an ecumenical council is really the only way to settle these difficult decisions. So ultimately, the theory came to be recognized that an ecumenical council is the supreme ecclesial authority. This explains why Catholic reform was very slow to start before Trent. All during the 15th century and in much of the 14th century, people recognized that the church needed reformation, but the popes would always point to the other clergy, it needs to start there, and the other clergy would always point to the pope and say it needs to start there. So without a real clear understanding of who was in charge, it frankly started nowhere. This also explains why the church was very slow to call an ecumenical council in response to Martin Luther. It took 30 years for the Council of Trent to be called. Again, the popes were fearful of reigniting this conciliar tradition and having to battle a somewhat renegade council that went a little bit off the reservation. Now, the reforms of the Council of Trent were, for the most part, implemented rather completely through a process of synodality. The Council of Trent, in one of its last decrees in 1563, mandated that dioceses and provinces have regular synods. And these regular synods would work towards the reform of the clergy. And the basic idea was that the clergy, reforming the clergy, would thereby create a trickle-down effect, and that trickle-down effect would raise the level of the water throughout the entire world if the clergy were holier and more resident. And this usually begins by mandating residence for bishops. In the latter part of the Middle Ages, the vast majority of bishops or pastors were simply not resident in the church to which they were called to serve. Why? Because a number of them, frankly, for pure financial personal gain, maintained multiple benefices. And that meant that they were drawing the income from multiple benefices. It's rather impossible for somebody to be the pastor of a church in Oxford and the bishop of a diocese in southern Italy and a member of the cathedral chapter in Warsaw and a canon of the cathedral in Switzerland all at the same time. So the reforms of the Council of Trent usually start by mandating residence for bishops and mandating residence for those who have care of souls. So once you had a bishop that was held to residency, he would then hold his clergy to residency. And when a resident bishop was ready to begin the question of reforms, an apostolic visitator, that is from Rome, would come and summon a provincial or a diocesan synod. Then, when the reforms started to gain ground and when the reforms started to come together, the bishops would enforce it and promote it by making periodic and regular visitations. This is the way in which change occurred throughout the entire Catholic Church in the first half of the 16th century, in the second half of the 16th century, and then straight through into the 17th century. Now, If this is all about essentially reforming the clergy, what does reform of the clergy look like? It starts really with the foundation of a seminary system. Prior to the Council of Trent, priests were generally apprenticed to their local parish priest. And then when they had enough basic reading and writing skills and basic pastoral practice of how to administer the sacraments, the parish priest would take them to the bishop, who would then examine them. And if they were found worthy, he would call them to ordination. A much smaller group of clergy went through the university system. And then they became the highly trained, literate clergy that would staff chanceries and increasingly dioceses. The problem with both of those was that the university-trained clergy had no systematic spiritual or pastoral training. The clergy that were apprenticed to their pastor also had no spiritual training. And while they had pastoral training, they may have had very little, if no, theological training. So the goal of a seminary system is to provide for all of these things. Now, you have to think, when you're starting a whole system from scratch, you're really starting with founding two types of seminary, ideally in every diocese, or at least in every province. So this would be a minor seminary, which would go from middle through high school. So essentially from about age 12 to about age 18, and then major seminary. In the minor seminary, it would be on questions of reading and writing and basic logic and mathematics, etc. And major seminary would get into the questions of philosophy and theology. Now, these seminaries, again, as I pointed out, had three primary tasks. One, instill a moral and spiritual discipline. That is, do you have a regular prayer life? Are you committed to your promise of celibacy? And what does that look like? Well, essentially, we're taking you very young and forming you very young in a way in which we would foster growth in those areas. Again, even the notion of a seminary, really, its best translation is from the Latin seme, meaning a seed, where we would take a seedling and put it into a greenhouse and then give it lots of light, lots of water, lots of nutrition. It would bloom and plant relatively quickly, and then we would transplant it into the local parish of your choice. Not a bad image. The second thing that it would do is teach Orthodox Catholic theology. One of the things that was discovered is that on some fundamental questions, basically the nature of the church and the nature of grace and sin in life, there were all kinds of theological opinions without a very clear, defined Catholic teaching. Trent clearly defined Catholic teaching, and now it spread it through its seminary system. The third was to teach practical skills for pastoral practice, how to be a good confessor, how to be a good catechist, and how to be a good preacher in the Tridentine sense, which was how to do moral and doctrinal preaching, not necessarily to do the homiletics that you hear regularly every Sunday, which is based on the scriptures. Tridentine preaching was much more around behavior and belief, and much less about spirituality and, frankly, discipleship from this sense. Now, you have to stop and think as well. What this also meant is that you were having to find land in which to have the seminary. You'd have to find professors and formators to staff the seminaries. You'd also then have to find resources and money to feed, house, and take care of the seminarians for 6, 8, 10, 12 years. It's a very, very daunting proposition to organize a diocese or an archdiocese around all of this. And you can understand why this was clearly done via synods. Once you had a seminary-trained clergy that you could then begin to be resident in parishes, you had the buildup of a long-term pastoral effect on parishes. And this growth in what parochial life looked like would be continually evaluated by synods and visitations. What did it look like? An emphasis on reception of the Eucharist, generally 4 times per year. So what defined a good Catholic was going to the Eucharist, again, not too frequently in this period. Frequent Eucharist, that is the practice of today, when virtually almost everyone at almost every Mass goes to communion, was simply not the practice until the beginning of the 20th century. So you generally went to Eucharist perhaps 4 times in a year. But you made much more frequent sacramental confession. So you had to have resident clergy that would both promote the reception of the Eucharist and promote going to confession, which means, of course, that the parish priest would have to be much more available in the confessional. Secondly, the flock was formed by regular Sunday moralistic preaching on doctrine and morals, which would then be reinforced by Sunday afternoon adult catechesis, which was the standard Tridentine pastoral practice. There would be a great encouragement to participate in confraternities and synodalities, church groups that generally strove for some combination of personal holiness and charitable activity. And so, of course, one of the typical personal holiness was that these confraternities or synodalities would be encouraged to have a communion Sunday or a communion breakfast, for those of us of a certain age that remember these from our youth, in which the whole confraternity would go to communion together, and thereby that meant that everyone would go to confession on the day before. This also led to frequent group devotions to the Eucharist, things like 40 hours devotions, things like exposition and benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, devotions to devotions to Jesus, things like the Stations of the Cross, devotions to Mary and the saints, public recitation of the rosaries, litanies, triduums, novenas. All of these kinds of things get to be much more group-oriented and popularly oriented when you have a resident priest who is there to lead, encourage, and really kind of stress the importance of all of these for everybody's spiritual life. Now, it's also interesting, the synod process was aided by technology, that is, mass printing. So if the synod is interested in the correct celebration of Mass, it helps that everybody has a printed, accurate Roman Missal. If everyone is interested that Catholic teaching really be taught, it's important to have a Tridentine catechism that will define that. If you want priests to pray more regularly, it's a good thing to have a printed breviary or a printed liturgy of the hours for them to use. If you want priests to preach and they're not natural preachers, it helps to have printed means of sermon compilations. So again, all of these things were really not Mass available up until the beginning of the 16th century. So The advances of the Council of Trent, promoted by synods, were also promoted by technology of mass communication at this point. What are the effects of implementing this Tridentine reform? Again, and this Tridentine reform basically happened via synods. Residents of a seminary-trained clergy leads to laity who are better catechized, more connected to the sacraments, and more connected to devotions. Creating seminaries also leads to a more clericalized culture. That is, the experience of seminary and the way it trained young male minds created a much stronger clerical caste in which clergy tended to think and act quite differently from the laity, which was not very much the case prior to the Council of Trent. Bishops and pastors are seen much more as cultic, sacramental figures. Prior to that, they were simply administrators of an ecclesiastical patrimony. So there is a much more spiritual, sacramental, and almost kind of cultic view of things. If the whole goal of the clergy is to be resident and be there for pastoral care, the church articulates a new principle: lex suprema ecclesiae cura animarum. The supreme law of the church is caring for souls. Now, this creates a system that lasts at least into the mid-20th century. Many of us over the age of, let's say, 60 have very clear memories of this Tridentine system that is still operative in many ways, but it's very, very much a part of what many of our growing up as young Catholics really meant. And the point to underline here is that synodality is a linchpin of this. So let me just stop the share and come back to me. I hope this has been helpful to show you how synodality is not a novel thing of Pope Francis. The way in which it is applied is somewhat novel. But again, synodality is a way in which to address some of the major challenges that are in the church of today. Again, as a contemporary church historian, I would posit that the major challenge, once again, is the decreasing role of religion, particularly in the Western world or Europe, North America, Canada, Australia, predominantly. I think that's a simply major issue that the Synod is trying to address. It's also trying to foster and implement the places where the church is growing rapidly, and that would be Africa and Asia. Our own participation in the Synod process, I heartily invite you, if you found these videos to be helpful, to join us on Saturday, October 28th from 9 until 12, where we'll be looking at the second major topic, which is mission, and the phraseology is co-responsibility for mission. So I hope to see you there so that we could foster and promote together ways in which to make Newman much more mission-oriented, other-oriented, and ways to go out into the peripheries around us. Thank you very much. God bless, and see you next week for the fourth and final installment, which is how the American church used synodality in the 19th century to form itself. Thank you. Bye.